This is Lynn Fraser. I'm with the Kiloby Center for Recovery. I'm here today with the Radical Recovery Summit, interviewing Brian Adler. He is a certified facilitator of the inquiries. He's worked at the Kiloby Center, and he has a long background of other work as well. And I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, Lynn. I guess a little over 25 years ago, I became interested in Buddhist meditation and wound up going to Naropa to finish my BA and do an MA. And what I was studying at Naropa was somatic psychology, which is essentially the field of psychology that is all about noticing how our thoughts and our patterns of thinking manifest in the body. And simultaneously, because I was at Naropa, which is a Buddhist-inspired college, I was studying Buddhism, and specifically emptiness teachings in Buddhism, which is very similar to the living inquiries on findability. And so I wound up noticing how ultimately they were different approaches to the same thing. So fast forward 20-something years, when I first came across Scott and his work, I was immediately drawn to it because it's so much an integration of exactly the Buddhist emptiness teachings and the practices of somatic psychology. So, and I've been doing, I worked at the center off and on for a couple years, and I've been a facilitator now for about 4 years. I also spent, I guess, almost 20 years now doing the work of Byron Katie, which is a really powerful practice, particularly when it's done with a somatic emphasis that not everyone does, but I think more and more, I think actually somatic awareness is making inroads in general in spiritual inquiry practices, which is a wonderful thing. So that's been a big, I guess, influence for me also. And, you know, it's a totally different approach than the living inquiries, but what's the same is they both create a space in which we can hold our stories rather than believe them, I guess. So.
Yeah, that's an important difference.
Yeah, I think that's the difference, is
Right.
holding our thoughts instead of believing them.
Right.
I was originally drawn to Scott's work because the two things I studied at Naropa were somatic psychology and Buddhist emptiness teachings. And when I saw he was integrating those, I was like,
wow.
I was actually like, well, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Yeah, and for me, part of what drew me to him was I teach yoga and meditation, and he's so clear the way he works with thoughts, which I had never, I'd done inquiry before, but not like that. And so that was so helpful. And then this whole somatic side of it as well, and the energy in the body. And so it's a really natural pairing kind of for me as well. Yeah.
I've had a number of clients who had food addiction, and I've learned through that process that I think it might be one of the hardest addictions to work, for the person who's suffering from it to work with it.
Yeah, well, and it's not an all or nothing. It's
exactly, because you can't just stop.
Yeah.
I know I've been really humbled and moved by watching some of the clients I've worked with. Work with it.
Right. So my experience with that is that as the underlying trauma is healed, that it becomes easier to work with. I don't really think we can work with it unless, like when we're at that level of desperation, there isn't a lot of room there.
Oh yeah. Like I mean, with the clients I've worked with, we would talk about the food, but what we actually worked with was, mostly their self concepts.
Right.
That were really strong.
Yeah.
Really, really strong.
Yeah. A lot of shaming and
a tremendous amount of self-aggression.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to see the common threads through different types of addiction too. Yeah. But I think everybody who's got an addiction's got some kind of trauma going on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's particularly a lot of self-aggression with food addiction. That's what I've seen.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about why that is?
I don't know why it would be with food addiction in particular, but I really don't think food. I mean, it's the trauma. There's just like so much anguish
Hmm.
in like I think. I mean, it's all addiction is an addiction to thinking, um, and fixating on certain identities. But I think it seems like it's particularly pronounced with the food addiction clients I've worked with,
Hmm.
that their thinking is just really aggressive and really solid and really relentless.
So what seems to help?
Well, I think it's a lot of why I started to focus on compassion as being like a really central theme in how I work, because using the inquiry with any sort of agenda to have an insight, even though the insight, were it to come, would be very relieving, it perpetuated this idea for the client, this identity that there was something they were missing, something they lacked that they needed, which wasn't helpful at all. So really organically, my approach started to morph from, I mean, at the most fundamental level, it morphed from, is this you? Is this a threat? Is this a compulsion? To, is there space for this to be as it is?
Hmm.
And what I started finding is, in the same way that, yes, it's me is not a problem because it just tells you that there's more mining, there's more to look at. If
Hmm.
there isn't space for something, then there's something else arising that is making it seem like there isn't space for it.
Right.
And that's the thing that's actually longing, even just like as if it were an actual person inside of us. It's an experience that's longing to be seen, to be recognized. And the thing that I found is, when they noticed that thing that was behind not getting recognized, compassion wasn't something they had to cultivate in order to meet it. Compassion was something that just sort of organically and spontaneously arose in the moment of recognizing it. Like, for example, there'd be a client would be struggling with something, and then they'd recognize that there's a longing for relief from the pain that's
Hmm.
right behind that. And as soon as they notice the longing for relief, there'd be like this oh moment, and this flood of compassion. And it was just immediately obvious that that flood of compassion is the heart of rest, because in that moment, everything is totally okay exactly as it is. And in that moment, all the identification stops, all of the Velcroing comes to rest. So over time, the way that I approached the work started to be more about recognizing that Velcro isn't something that needs to be seen through. It's just something that needs to be seen. Not seen through as in um, defeated somehow, but it needs to be seen just like a person wants to be seen, a person wants to be heard. And that the more that that happened, it would all, rest would just naturally emerge. So, yeah, so in the groups that I lead, I really think this is why people appreciate them. I emphasize that it's not about changing any thought or feeling. It's not knowing something that we don't know. It's not having any experience we're not having. It's being interested in seeing and feeling and recognizing what's actually here, and discovering this authentic and genuine compassion for it. And then all of the insights that non-dual teachers talk about, they just come from that moment.
Right. So what about safety? How is it that people could feel safe enough to go in and really feel what's going on? Because of course
Well,
addiction is all about getting out of it.
right. So the key, and I really, I actually just got this book. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's all about how mindfulness practices are potentially re-traumatizing
Hmm.
because so many people approach mindfulness from this point of view of um, it's all about being aware of the thing that's difficult to be aware of, and like I mean, I did traditional Buddhist meditation for years, and it's almost like it's this macho culture of sit there and be with it,
Yeah.
and it's absolutely, I mean, it's traumatic even for someone who doesn't have a lot of trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
So something that I always emphasize is that if it feels like enduring what's uncomfortable, it's not what we're talking about. That that it's the epitome of gentleness. And so in a moment, if we're feeling something that hurts to feel, this process isn't just feeling the hurt, it's honoring and listening to it and allowing for the part of us that doesn't want to feel it. Essentially feeling, making space for the sense of ourselves as wanting relief from the feeling or not wanting to feel the feeling. And I mean, I can't tell you how many clients I've had where I could see that what they were actually suffering in the moment was trying so hard to fix themselves.
Right.
And when they got just a little bit of space or permission, like I told, it's in therapy, there's this idea of resisting clients. And I just think that's a completely unhelpful paradigm to think that someone can be resistant,
Yeah.
because the only thing that's ever happening is that somebody is having some experience that is calling out for being seen and being honored exactly as it is.
Hmm.
So one of the key things that always helps people go deeper is making space for the part of them that doesn't want to go deeper, that doesn't feel ready. Like honoring, uh, listening to the part of them that's saying no. In
Right.
fact, I often compare it um, in in um, in millennial um, culture. There's a lot of talk about consent these days, like in
Hmm.
relationships. And the way that I think of this work is essentially having a healthy consent culture with our own experience, which absolutely has to start with honoring our no's. When we're honoring the part of us that's saying no, we're saying yes to that no. And
Right.
that's the way in. And of course that, if someone feels heard, if that feeling feels heard, then the sense of unsafety is going to relax, because
Right.
that's all it wanted. It just wanted to feel heard, respected.
Hmm.
So
So Gabor Mate has this process called compassionate inquiry. And one of the things he said was it's hard for people to have compassion for themselves because, in part, we and this I'm not going to attribute it all to him because I don't want to put words in his mouth. So I took that, and what he did in the group was he would say to somebody, there was a woman who was talking about an uncle or I think it was a family friend or something, or godfather, who was sitting on the couch with her. She's like 5 years old, and he's starting to touch her inappropriately. And so she went from being this sunny 5-year-old kid who was really happy to being really disturbed, acting out, and her parents didn't notice. So one of the things he said, you have to be very devoted as a parent to not notice that's going on. You have to really not want to see it. 5-year-olds aren't very sophisticated, in terms of hiding things. And so she went through all of this kind of really traumatic period and didn't disclose until much later. And, the whole kind of thing that happens in those situations. And one of the things he had her do is he said, so if your daughter was 5 years old and she was starting to display that kind of behavior, would you notice? And she's like, absolutely, I would notice. And he said, so if she was in that situation, what would you want to say to her? And so what he was doing there was, and he talked about it a little bit afterwards, he says, it's very hard for us to have compassion for ourselves. And it's much easier for us to have compassion for someone else. And I mean, that's well known, right? I mean, we all have seen that. And so as a practice, he would have, and I've done that quite a bit in, working with the people that I work with, is have them say, well, if that was your sister, or if that was someone you loved, or if that was your child, would you have compassion for them? And it's like, absolutely, I would have compassion for them. And and so this is the part that I'm kind of still working with. Is there is something about, the core deficiency stories, the root of those is that we have an experience of disconnection with a parent, and it's in our best interest for survival to keep that connection with the parent. So we turn against ourselves instead of seeing it for what it really is. And so we develop, we have an experience of I'm not lovable, so we develop the belief that we're not lovable. And so my sense is that we can't have compassion for ourselves because we have this hope, or kind of a desperate hope, that if we could have just done something different, it wouldn't have happened to us. And it's a carryover from when we were children, that kind of, I can't have compassion for myself because I should have done something different.
Right.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I see this, which I think is ultimately the same thing you're describing. I see this catch-22 where essentially what people are suffering is their drive for healing, in a sense, combined with a sense of futility about it. So like they have this identity as being broken,
Mm-hmm.
and they have this really intense longing for something positive to happen. And the more that they put, like the more that they're suffering, the more the whole thing solidifies, and the more the whole thing solidifies, that is their suffering. And I think in traditional, this is essentially what spiritual seekers seek, people who actually have like a spiritual seeking addiction. Essentially what they wind up doing is they identify the sense of self as the problem, and they're trying to see through it. They're trying to get rid of it. They're trying to make it stop in some way. The key moment, I think, is not when the deficiency story stops, not when it's seen through, but when it's just simply recognized in a compassionate way. When and I've seen this with clients countless times, when they experience themselves as the one holding the sense of deficiency rather than the one needing to be held, everything shifts. And that's something that happens really reliably, where people, I mean, I have this one client who has 4 decades of depression, and her story about the inescapability of the depression is really convincing.
Mm-hmm.
And if I ever get hooked that it needs a solution, then I'm going to be just as despairing as she is.
Right.
But what happens instead is, together we create a space where she can recognize that that's what's happening. What's present is this sense of self in a hell realm of catch-22, impossible suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happening. It's an experience of a sense of self. And not only is it an experience of a sense of self, but it's an experience of a sense of self that has at its core a suffering that the client can empathize with because they've experienced it for so long. And so essentially it's this moment where they empathize with their own suffering, just like they would want another person to do.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not trying to fix it. They're not trying to change it. They're not trying to be relieved of it. They're not trying to escape it. They're empathizing with it exactly like they would with another person. Like,
Right.
oh, yeah, I hear you, basically. And in that moment, I mean, usually when they have that kind of moment, I say that's rest. When all of your thoughts and feelings have space to be exactly as they are, and you experience yourself as the intelligence as the space in which it's all completely okay to be as it is. That's rest. And I think it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but I've seen a lot of clients, their go-to reaction to this, we all have this thing that arises in its own characteristic way. It does in our mind, this suffering pattern of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
When the spontaneous reaction is like, oh, I see you, rather than, oh shit, what am I going to do about you?
Right.
Then that's the shift.
And we will always defend ourselves against something that's trying to change us.
Yes, exactly. Which it's so ironic because that's what clients project onto facilitators and therapists and what have you. But at the same time, that's why they're in a war with themselves, because one part of them is trying to change another part that doesn't want to be changed. It wants to be heard and respected as it is.
Right. And honored for the service that it's given us all these decades.
Yeah. Because it has something. It's legitimate. It has a legitimate thing it's trying to say.
Right.
Sometimes I use the phrase real but not true, that the experience is real even if the story isn't true. And the more we honor how real it is to feel this experience, the more the trueness of the story will start to dissipate.
Right. Mm. So when you're working with people around spiritual seeking, is that any different than working with other kinds of addiction?
Well, it can be trickier because the reason why they're feeding their addiction by having a session with me in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
Mm-hmm.
So they're actively using. It's
That's
a
ironic.
yeah. It's a big deal because what they're searching for is a shift. They're searching for some sort of change, and what I'm interested in doing is holding space for that, and creating a space where they can recognize that, where what they're after is the fulfillment of what it's after. And yeah, I think there's there are a lot of beliefs embedded in there, beliefs that I used to have,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't want to step on toes. Like if you believe there's something that you haven't experienced that you need to be experiencing, I don't want to tell you that's not true. But fundamentally, it is the same process. And typically what happens, and I think sometimes people see this and sometimes they don't. Typically what happens is when someone is compassionately holding a space for their identity as being unenlightened or whatever it is that there's, as someone who hasn't gotten it,
Mm-hmm.
to the degree they're holding space for that, they've woken up from that whole story that there's something like that needs to happen. But what I notice is a lot of times is then they go and they think, but I needed your help to do it, and
Wow.
and it's something that can come and go. It's a really embedded story, this idea that there's something that's either here or it's gone, and if it's gone, we have to try to get it back.
Right.
But fundamentally, it's really the same process. I really think the way I think of it is that thoughts and feelings are arising, and they're either creating this Velcro thing or they're being met spaciously. And ultimately, the way that I work is in meeting the Velcro in such a way that even the Velcro isn't experienced as something that needs to change. It's really just more thoughts and feelings that need to be met.
Mm-hmm.
So that even the sense, even the really, really, really vivid, I mean, I still experience this. I still experience, you know, I do, I mean, I work with my own mind in moments that I'm really, really triggered. There are moments where the sense of being someone with a problem is extremely vivid.
Mm-hmm.
And the paradigm shift from believing, yes, I am someone with a problem, and I'm gonna do some process to fix that problem, to just making space for the very vivid constellation of thoughts and feelings that create this sense of problem. I mean, that is the solution. When there's space for the sense of a problem, there's no problem. So like one of the things I do in my groups when I lead the guided rest is a lot of people think of this as calming down and centering and relaxing. I encourage people to really notice whatever part of them is agitated or restless or troubled. And from the very beginning, I'm like, you know, it's great that that's here. What we're here for is to give that experience a place to be. We're not looking for a solution or a remedy for that. We're creating an environment where that feeling or that constellation of thoughts can finally have permission just to be here.
Right.
And yeah, and in my own experience, it's so much an easier way. Like another thing I do with particularly spiritual seeking clients, particularly if they're projecting onto me that I have some sort of spiritual attainment, I'm really emphatic from the get-go that I experience any of the thoughts and feelings I might ever have experienced. That
Mm-hmm.
if anything has changed, I just have more confidence in being able to be with it.
Right.
And that confidence comes from knowing how to be gentle with it and compassionate with it. But not, it's so not about achieving something where those kinds of things don't arise anymore. And I'm really suspicious about the teachers who seem to project some kind of image as someone who no longer experiences mind doing what mind does.
Right.
I'm skeptical.
That's my experience too, is that it's I don't believe the thoughts the way I used to. I don't have to get away from them the way I used to. So they just don't trouble me as much. And that's what gives us that capacity and that confidence that we can just be with it. It's not that it's not going to come up, but I've noticed that much fewer troubling thoughts.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's no coincidence. I mean,
Right.
like clients have sometimes asked me, will there ever be an end to this?
Right.
And I say there absolutely could be, but long before there's an end to it, there won't need to be, because it'll be okay that it's here.
Right. That's a great answer. Yeah. So what about people who have a unity experience? What's the what are your thoughts about that, specifically in terms of addiction, spiritual addiction, or any other kind of addiction?
Well, I think just like any other highly desirable experience, it's potentially a catalyst for addiction. I mean, I think a lot of spiritual seekers have had a unity experience, and then something else started arising, and that was difficult. I mean, I've experienced that myself. In fact, when I was in my early 20s, I had some really profound experiences that, on the one hand, it was great because it motivated me to keep my life orientation in this direction. But on the other hand, it resulted in a lot of suffering because there was really, after that, there was an identity of having had some sort of awakening that was lost. And it took a long time for me to recognize that the identity itself was what I was suffering.
The identity of being someone who's had that awakening
And lost it.
and lost it.
Yeah. So like the only thing I was suffering was the identity of being somebody with that experience. So yeah, I mean, really, anytime our spirituality is about preferencing some thoughts and feelings, or some, when I say thoughts and feelings, I really mean the entire gestalt of anytime it's about preferencing some possible experience rather than another, there's gonna be a struggle.
Right.
So for myself, I don't experience a longing for that anymore, and sometimes it comes. I mean, what I was talking about, that moment of compassionate allowing can go on for, like infinitely. It can be profoundly deep, but I don't think it's useful to turn that into a goal at all.
Right. In the meditation tradition that I study in, it's a yoga meditation, not Buddhist. But one thing they always talked about right at the beginning was don't go after the experiences. And if you do have an experience, don't try to get it back.
Yeah.
And I would really notice that as soon as I would start to go deeper, I'd be like, oh, and then it's like, oh,
Yeah, totally.
you just can't grab it. It doesn't work that way.
Something else I want to say about this, and I think I've had my own process of being disillusioned in a
Mhm.
positive sense, not a negative sense,
Mhm.
freedom,
Freedom from illusion.
illusion,
Yeah.
um, with regard to spirituality. But I was good friends with a young woman who she had a very profound awakening.
Hmm.
And during the time that I knew her, I spent a lot of time with Byron Katie years ago.
Hmm.
And in moments of eye contact with Byron Katie, there was a presence without any, just like radiant consciousness without a sense of there being a separate self. And
Hmm.
it was sort of stunning. Like I would look in her eyes and be like, oh, this is what this is really about.
Hmm.
And it was remarkable. And when I became friends with this young woman, she had an element of that. This is a woman who'd struggled with addiction and depression for a really long time. And I would make eye contact with her and I would experience that same thing where I would feel like this contact high of awakening,
Hmm.
just spending time with her. And it was remarkable. And I started having stories of, oh, I remember even talking to Scott about this. Something happened for her. I'm playing in the kiddie pool. Something happened for her that's really profound. And I'm missing, and I would have moments where I would actually start to crave. I don't know what it is that she's experiencing, but I'm missing it.
Hmm.
And I don't know what her process was, and that's not the reason why I tell the story. But I do know that the story of getting somewhere or someone else getting somewhere, which is where we all need to be, it's not a helpful story.
Right.
And I truly think anything is possible, and that humility in the face of all of it is probably a good idea.
Right. Yeah. When it really goes to show how much suffering there is to, whatever it was that was underlying
Exactly.
her original drug use wasn't
Exactly.
cured by the awakening.
Exactly. And I mean, it's like, I remember when I first got to know Scott, I thought it was cute that he still did his own looking.
Oh,
And
okay.
what I mean by cute is like, I thought, oh, that's really, like he's hanging out with us doing what we do. How that's nice of him. But I had some projection that he somehow,
Mm.
he didn't really need to do it. It wasn't really useful for him. He was just sort of doing it because he was plugging that it's a good thing to be doing.
Mhm.
And um and now I really just feel like I recognize that there's just, there's no end to that. And if you think there's an end to that, then then you might wind up having, life remind you that there isn't.
Right. Right. Yeah, I love how practical Scott is, and he doesn't allow any kind of spiritual glomming on to him. He just doesn't. It's not part of the culture of being around him.
Right. But more importantly, he
He
has
does
never stopped looking himself.
exactly. Yeah.
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 Which I think is not that common actually among people who are in the role of teacher. Which
No.
I think is why there's so many falls from grace, because they stop doing their own work.
Right. Yeah. Well, and one version of enlightenment is being, you're just in that bliss state all the time. You're always in the unity experience. It's still an experience.
Right.
And I'm much more interested in how is it for you in your everyday life, and what is it that's coming up, and can you be with that, and can you be kind with yourself?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
to me is way more important
Yeah.
than whether or not you've had that big blissful experience.
Now, having said that, when there's a lot of space for the sense of self, for the sense of deficient self, when there's a lot of space for that, there is a really deep recognition that that's not who or what we are. There is a real shift that happens.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think like speaking accurately, that relief from identification with suffering is possible, while simultaneously uh, describing it. I mean, I think it's like there's humility in actual relief from suffering, not some sort of sense of accomplishment.
Right.
Because the humility makes it possible for us to look directly at this core deficiency, and if we can look at it directly, we can be with it. But if
Mhm.
we're I mean, I guess I think that's what happens for people who wind up having some sort of fall, is they develop some kind of identity as being beyond something, and then everything that's having to be disenfranchised in order to maintain that illusion
Right.
winds up festering.
Right. And then there's kind of an automatic turning away from our own work when that's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
I find there's a lot of shoulds inherent in spiritual seeking too. I should be able to manage this without eating, or I should be able to never have a jealous thought, or there's a lot of ideas that we have of
Yeah.
what it's like, or what it would be like to be spiritually awakened.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. That's like, I mean, I've reached the point where even if I'm mistaken, I'm good with that. Like in terms of like this, it may not be that this is the ultimate practice, but it really works for me to, with kindness and compassion and gentleness, make room for whatever's actually appearing in my mind. And if that isn't, like sometimes people will uh, describe some sort of spiritual realization or state or something that seems like it might be beyond that. And more and more, I'm fine with that, because it feels good just to know how to stand in the position of allowing my mind to be exactly as it is, rather than trying to find some solution or remedy.
Well, and I think sometimes the experience of oneness or a unity experience be kind of hopeful, like when you're back down in the trenches, at least you know that that is possible. And so I think in that sense it's helpful, not in the sense of trying to get back to it, but just knowing that that actually is possible too. And then every time we do our own work, or when we're working with somebody, people have the direct experience of being able to be present with their own experience. And that builds confidence too.
Yeah, yeah,
So often it's like, there's no way that I can actually go into that. And we defend ourselves absolutely against whatever it is that's happening. And then we have a little experience of, for a couple minutes with Brian, it was okay. Or I actually went into that and I survived it. I had one of those when I first started doing the inquiries, and it was probably about 6 months in. I'd been working with Colette Kelso every week. So I knew her and I trusted her. And I had this big pain in my heart center that was like, call 911, you're going to die. And I knew that it was not a heart attack. So I just stayed with it. And it was about 3 minutes of that pain. And it finally just started to dissolve and got softer, and then it was gone.
Hmm.
And I thought, I've been avoiding that 3 minutes for 50 years,
Wow.
and like, wow. And I survived that 3 minutes. And that too is one of the experiences then that gives me that confidence
Hmm.
that I can actually, there's nothing I couldn't be present with. It might be painful or difficult, but I know I can be present with whatever is happening because I've had that experience so many times now.
Right. And I really, so to me, that's what this work is. It's the intelligence that knows that we can be with our experience as it is.
Right.
And so, like, getting back to the conversation with spiritual seekers, I think to some degree the conversation is like just a reframing that we're not trying, this is not a process of replacing some state with some other state. It's the process of discovering we can be with what's here right now.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And another thing that I was just thinking of is whenever I see a client, even in a small way, have a moment of, like, so in a previous moment, some experience they were noticing wasn't okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden it is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's just incremental, like maybe it's not like pearly gates have opened and their heart is awash in love,
Right.
but relatively speaking, there's more space. It's more okay.
Yeah.
It's less threatening just to feel it and just to be with it.
Yeah.
I usually really I what do you call it? I bookmark that and I say, what we're doing is that it's that. So
Yeah.
however you can, and I really encourage people to own their own process of finding that, right? Like they don't have, because the way that the way that I facilitate is different than how you would or how Scott does. I facilitate in a way that made sense to my brain.
Right.
And ultimately I think what we all have to do, starting as clients, is find the way, is transition from being facilitated by the other person to finding the way that our own natural intelligence discovers that capacity to be with experience as it is.
Right.
And so I really I guess the phrase I'm looking for is I say, let's put a pin in that, because this is what we're here to do,
Right.
is just that. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's beautiful how
Yeah.
much can change just from that paradigm shift of, how do I change this to, it's actually okay to be here.
I think it's very helpful to point that out as well, to reflect back that this is actually where we're doing the real work is right now in this moment. That's very helpful for people to know. Because oftentimes people have these ideas about it should be the heart awash with love.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like what the other day in group, she shared this 1 or 2 minutes about feeling a lot kinder towards her experience. And I was just like, as emphatic as I knew how to be. I was like, that's it.
Mhm.
That's not like just good enough or something. That's it. That's really it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and 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 it, there was relief, there was relief. And
Mhm.
like, it's just, I could see there was something that she had been really longing for, and just that, this is this'll do, this
Yeah.
this will
Yeah.
do.
You are working so much deeper than people who are just looking through identities because you're actually changing your relationship inside of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're becoming able to actually be present with compassion and acceptance. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's like, and I don't know how it happened exactly. It almost feels like there's I guess is the word zeitgeist. There's like a zeitgeist in the living inquiries community. Like, it seems like a lot of us as facilitators, and Scott, everyone has shifted in the last 4 or 5 years where that's much more the emphasis and the space that we're holding for this work. And I don't think it was like any sort of organized plan particularly.
Right.
It just sort of happened. And I love, I can't even begin to emphasize how much I love that is what we've become and what we're doing.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. And I think that's a result of the work, of doing our
Right.
own work. And I know that probably in most traditions, people emphasize that, but in the living inquiries, it's really emphasized that if you're facilitating, you need to also be doing your own work.
Yeah.
And partly that's inspired by Scott, who is still doing his work and who shares about that and will say, you know, this is what I'm working with right now. And I'm always impressed by how deep it goes. And you know, he'll say he said a few years ago, he says, every morning I wake up and I just lay in bed for an hour and inquire into the energy in my gut. And I'm like, wow, that's impressive. You know, that he's
Yeah.
still interested and he's still working with the nuances of that, and things are still coming up. And
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm sort of skeptical of anyone who describes themselves as someone who doesn't experience mind embodying doing what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Most of what I do is work with clients who are either suffering from depression or anxiety or addiction.
And you do most of your work online?
I do 90% of it online.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah. And how could people get a hold of you? What's your email address?
BrianEAdler@gmail.com. It's 919-442-8790.
Okay. And you're in North Carolina?
I'm outside of Asheville, yeah, which
Okay.
is a great place to be doing this kind of work.
Right. It's a good community there.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Brian.
I
It's
really enjoyed
a
it.
real pleasure. Yeah. It's lovely
Yeah.
to talk about the living inquiries and to talk about, you know, the depth that we can go to, and,
Yeah.
you know, to bring in trauma and presence and addiction, all of the different ways that that works. And yet to come back to that same basic practice of allowing it to be as it is.
I think that when there's no limit on how profound it can be, but also how ordinary it
Mm,
is simultaneously, that's the sweet spot. You know,
right.
it's tremendously profound, and it's also, you know, it's just being here with this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Go to kilobicenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online, or you could purchase an all-access pass. kilobicenter.com.